Hi, I'm Ted Swiecki, and this is the first of three parts of a talk on Phytophthora root rot diseases affecting native plants in California. So what are Phytophtheras and why should we be concerned about them? Well, Phytophtheras are a group of plant pathogens that were first described in the 1860s by Anton de Berry. He gave the genus its name in 1875. That name means plant destroyer. The first named species was Phytophthora infestans, the cause of potato late blight. It is a relatively narrow for Phytophthora host range, having about 130 hosts, most of which are in the genus Solanum. And is also known as the cause of the Irish potato famine, which caused a great deal of human suffering in the mid-1800s. It's an aerially dispersed pathogen, and that differs from the ones that I'll be mostly talking about. So another Phytophthora you may be familiar with, particularly from Chris Lee's talk in this same series, is Phytophthora ramorum, the cause of sudden oak death in tan oak and various susceptible oaks. This is also an aerially dispersed pathogen. It has a wider host range than Phytophthora infestans, with at least 130 known hosts in a number of genera and families. If we compare this to the root-rotting Phytophtheras, we find that many of them have much wider host range. Phytophthora cinnamomi with well over 3,000 hosts in more than 100 families. Phytophthora cactorum, another one with many hosts in over 100 families. And all these host ranges are really artificially low because we don't really know the full range of all the plants that can be infected by these species. Phytophtheras are in a group known as the water molds. They're not really fungi, but they have a similar growth form. They produce zoospores, and in water, which we're seeing here, zoospores are released from sporangia, and these zoospores are attracted to host roots and cause infections in them. There's at least 150 named and provisional species, and many more beyond that that have not yet been described. So there's a wide variety of diverse organisms. To the degree that people are familiar with these, they may be familiar with them in urban environments, in horticultural situations, where they cause decline and death of plants, landscape plants. In this case, these plantoions were killed by Phytophthora cactorum root rot. Here's a planted Quercus robur that has severe stem cankers associated with Phytophthora cinnamomi, actually running farther up the stem than we would typically see, but showing that you can get the same sorts of bleeding and cankers you see in sudden oak death. A more common situation is where the pathogen has been introduced into the root zone of existing plants like oaks, where with a combination of excessive watering and other impacts, these trees become infected, and they also develop cankers, again, very similar to what we would see in sudden oak death. But these are cankers that are coming up from the root systems, not ones where the infection occurs through the bark. So we're really going to be focusing in this talk on destructive Phytophthora pathogens in natural situations in native habitats. And it's important to note these are introduced pathogens in these habitats. The plants that are here have never really been exposed to these Phytophtheras during their recent evolution, so they don't have resistance related to exposure to Phytophtheras. Now, fortunately, not everything is universally susceptible, but the point is when we have certain hosts, such as madrone showing here, that are very susceptible, the results can be quite devastating. And actually, I'd like to start by talking about the first example of this in a native California habitat. We actually documented in the early 2000s, around 2002, we first found that Island manzanita, a rare plant in the foothills of the Sierra Nevada, it's a federally threatened species, has a very restricted range, and in parts of its range it was dying out massively, and we found that what was happening is that these areas, Phytophthora cinnamomi had been introduced, and this is quite a devastating disease on these plants. There's some video to kind of show, give you a better feel for what it looks like as you're walking around these landscapes. These larger dead plants that we're looking at scattered around here are Phytophthora killed manzanitas. That would be the Arctostaphylos viscida, the white-leaf manzanita. And you can see that they're pretty much selectively taken out relative to these oaks, these interior live oaks, which are still surviving in these areas. But as we'll talk about later on, they're not necessarily completely immune to this particular pathogen. The species that's the rare manzanita species is found over here to the right side, and it has these finer branches. That is Arctostaphylos myrtifolia, the ion manzanita. And it's also exceptionally sensitive to this pathogen, and it essentially is killed within a year or two of being exposed. We see other surviving plants. This is chamise, and it can persist in these areas, but you can see there's quite a bit of dieback, and that oak in the background you can also see is showing a lot of dieback and thinning. But compared to the manzanitas here, there's little comparison there. Clearly, the manzanitas are much more sensitive to this particular pathogen and are killed quite readily. Now you're seeing that there's not much going on in these areas that have been killed. And that's because not a lot of other things can grow in these soils. They're very extreme soils with low pHs. So they're actually not favorable to much plant growth. In this particular site nearby, perhaps the situation is a little bit less extreme. We see some grasses filling in, but this was all ion manzanita stand, and it's all been killed by Phytophthora cinnamomi. You can see the disease edge there is fairly sharp in this situation between the live and the dead. And the other thing we see is that occasionally we get some regeneration in this area, in these areas, but it's killed within a few years when the inoculum in the soil is encountered by the host roots. So we have plants that grew for a couple of years and then were killed shortly after that. So that's why we don't see manzanitas refilling into these areas. All we actually see is a progressive decline in the extent of this vegetation type. And as we look in this particular area here, these are plants that are starting to die. They're surrounded by other infested areas, and you can see the brown foliage there as these plants have been infected and are starting to be killed by the pathogen. A number of the oak species that occur in this area are also affected, not as rapidly as the manzanitas, but you can see the dieback on this scrub oak, Quercus viridifolium. We also see that even though Wislezinii, the interior live oak, was surviving in many of these areas, we see mortality of both seedlings or saplings as well as mature trees in this area. Now, a few years after we had come across this situation, we were alerted to another area where Arctostaphylos, rare Arctostaphylos, were dying. This is the Oakland Hills area. And we found that within the Huckleberry Botanic Preserve in the Oakland Hills, there was indeed mortality associated with Phytophthora cinnamomi infestation in these areas as well. This was kind of the initial area we identified in 2006. Here is that same mortality center 11 years later. The dead vegetation has mostly been removed. Some invasives like this pampas grass have moved in. And we do see manzanita in this area. This is a different species, Arctostaphylos crustacea. And we do see a number of plants in this area. So unlike the ion manzanita area where we're very uniform, more diversity here, but the Chinquapins in particular are dying out, as well as the pallid manzanitas. We go to this other spot about a few hundred meters to the east. You'll see quite a few pallid manzanitas also being affected in a similar situation. So as we showed, there are plants besides Arctostaphylos who are being killed, in particular giant Chinquapin, madrone, both quite sensitive and both showing up as dying off in these P. cinnamomi mortality centers. And we had noticed in our sudden oak death work similar situations in other locations, in particular Chinquapin State Park, where we've seen Arctostaphylos as well as madrones dying. We're also seeing bays that were dying and thinning out, even though the competition from the oaks was removed because the oaks had died. So we actually have the situation where Phytophthora cinnamomi is killing the bays, and Phytophthora ramorum in this case was killing many of the oaks in the same area. A few years later, we had a look at this other mortality center we were called in to investigate, and we also found the same pattern of dying and dead madrones over a wide area, as well as declining California bay. This also turned out to be associated with Phytophthora cinnamomi, but we also found some additional root-rotting Phytophthora species in this area. Other areas in the Greater Bay Area where we've seen cinnamomi include the Marin Municipal Watershed District land. You can see a dead madrone here and one that is fading out. Within a couple of years, that larger one is also dead. And again, we saw similar patterns, in this case a co-infection, or at least two species of Phytophthora cinnamomi and Cambivora at Jack London State Park. A little bit of a video view of that. It's often hard to get a good feel for what these look like from a couple of still pictures, but typically you have a clearing in an area where the canopy is dying. You will see, in this case, a dead understory plant. And this particular clearing has been here for a while. As we go further back, we zoom in, we can see in a distance that it extends out quite a few meters in that direction. We get to the edge of the mortality center, we don't see as much mortality, but we see plants thinning and dying. This is a tall toyon that is dying. The bays in this area are thinning, and this one madrone that we can see here has been dead for a while. So we know that the pathogen has been removed into this area as well. So Arctostaphylos and madrones, both in the Ericaceae, are very sensitive to Phytophthora cinnamomi in particular. One of the other species that is quite susceptible is giant Chinquapin. This is in the Fagaceae, the same family that oaks occur in. If we look at this aerial imagery of the area we're going to talk about here, we'll see that in 2002 it was visible that there is already some dieback occurring in this area. The next image shows that actually more dead canopies going out a little bit further, and possibly some mortality right along the trail here. As we progress further in time, we do see eventually there's some outlying mortality farther out, farther above the trail as well. And continuing forward, we eventually see that the level of infestation has gone well upslope. It's fanned out downslope. There's outliers well downslope as well. Some of these could be other agents, but certainly within the possibility that they're just spread from this mortality center. So this is the appearance of that area in 2013. You can see that there are redwoods in this area that have survived that are a little bit thin looking but still alive. But it's really the Chinquapins that have mostly died and in many cases fallen apart in this area. Upslope, more recent mortality. Downslope, quite a bit more older mortality. The trees have already decayed and have fallen down to the ground. You can still see a lot of slash down there, which is dead Chinquapins that were the overstory in this area. There are a few older dead plants here and there, but upslope, looking above the trail here, we can see more recent stuff, though, more recent mortality with some that has fallen apart. And there's the trail. So we returned to this site in 2019, and we're looking at from the same point, starting to rotate clockwise. Looking downslope, you see there's still new recent mortality occurring. Most of the older dead material is now decayed. This is the huckleberry understory, which is stressed looking but is not dead. As we look down the trail, we can see this old madrone is still standing right next to the trail. Across the trail, we see more mortality occurring. It's recent mortality upslope, but all of the older stuff has now fallen down and decayed. So after many years, there's a large canopy opening formed due to the loss of these overstory Chinquapins and madrones that were in this area. And we don't see those species refilling in this gap. We also see that the huckleberries are surviving but dying back. We don't have complete devastation. Ferns, of course, aren't affected here. The redwoods don't seem to be fairly tolerant. But we definitely have a change in the vegetation, and a long-lasting one that we're not going to see Chinquapins and drones reestablishing in this area. So I'd just like to end with a few images of some other oaks affected in Phytophthora root rot areas. Valley oaks, these are young valley oaks, and it's uncommon to see a young oak dying for any reason, really, especially a valley oak. But these were thinning out and dying. We found other plants that were in the area that were dying, including these toyons, and this turned out to be a Phytophthora cambivora affected area. This is that same area a little farther up. There's a larger tree here showing thinning here in 2015 and 2019, quite a bit more thinning still, a lot of epicormic sprouting on the branches. This is a larger valley oak in that same area, which has been declining over time and is nearly dead at this point. We also looked at some blue oaks that were showing thinning decline. You might just think these were water stress, and in fact, turns out that Phytophthora cambivora was causing some of that water stress by affecting the root systems of these plants. We've also seen Quercus agrifolia. This is on the peninsula. We can see thinning and dieback in areas where Phytophthora cambivora is present. And we also have seen in the same areas some more rapid die off of some of these plants. We can actually see cankers formed on some of these that look somewhat similar to sudden oak death cankers, but this is an area where there's no bay nearby to be the source of the inoculum, and we're in fact in a Phytophthora cambivora affected area. So to summarize, here's a number of the areas where we've sampled and found Phytophthora affecting native vegetation. And this is where we're actually seeing decline, dieback, mortality of these plants. So we know that across a variety of relatively dry habitats to moisture habitats, these introduce Phytophoras, especially P. cinnamomum and Cambivora, but many other species also are having impacts. So in part 2 of this talk, we'll be looking at why these areas became infested to begin with, and part 3 we'll try to address the question of what can be done to prevent these types of infestations that cause these destructive effects in these native plant habitats.